Hello, it is Dr. DeShavo moving you into Chapter 9, Gastrointestinal Function. Great system to study, and always I'm going to begin you with a little anatomy and physiology to begin with to give you the basics with which we need to work with to understand the pathophysiology. So coming on into gastrointestinal anatomy and physiology, I always joke, but this is true. It's one long tube from mouth to anus. Not a very funny joke, but it is one long tube. And the tube takes on very different characteristics along the way, but also it takes on different cell linings, which is an important aspect of the GI tract as well. So basically we have this big long tube, and on the inside of the tube, which is where you would stick your finger into your mouth and down along the GI tract, we have cells lining it. Underneath those cells, we have layers of smooth muscle, and those layers of smooth muscle are what are put into place to keep food and water moving down the throat through the GI tract to be processed. So just think of it as being one long tube from mouth to anus, and that'll help you to realize those layers. The other reason I say that is because our GI tract is open to all the external environmental factors such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, you name it. This is how we get a lot of the infectious agents into our bodies. So the GI tract actually has a very strong immune system, especially when we get into the small intestines. So remember that as well, that our GI tract helps with our immune system. All right, so let's get into the actual anatomical bread and butter structures. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this picture. So we have the oral cavity, which is where food will enter, and it will go through the esophagus down to the stomach. In the mouth, don't forget that we have glands, submandibular, sublingual, and parotid. I won't ask you their specific names, but if you remember that we have salivary glands in the mouth, that's enough to remember at this point. And they will secrete saliva that actually has enzymes that helps to destroy any bacteria and also start breaking carbohydrates down. We chew, and it moves down the esophagus. And at the top, or originally I was going to say, but at the top of the esophagus, which is the tube from the mouth to the stomach, there's actually an interim step I'll show you in just a second. But let's just think esophagus. The esophagus is going to be skeletal muscle at the top, which is voluntary, but then smooth muscle at the bottom. It transitions. So then our body can just manually take over putting foodstuffs in and digesting it the rest of the way. At the top, right where the mouth is, we have a common tube through which food, water, and air pass. That is the pharynx, okay? There's different parts. There's nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Just remember pharynx is the common tube through which food and water will pass, and air. When air comes down, it's going to go into the trachea. Food and water, hopefully, go to the esophagus. The esophagus obviously goes to the stomach by passing through the diaphragm. I have a picture later. There's an important reason we need to know that, because the diaphragm helps to keep the sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach closed. And a sphincter is just a tightening of that smooth muscle along the GI tract. If we don't keep this sphincter closed, we can actually get a reflux of acidity from the stomach. We'll get into that. We have the stomach. I have another picture of the stomach that I'm going to show you all the parts of the stomach. This will connect into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestines. That curves around, and all of these yellow in the center are the rest of the small intestines, which include jejunum and ileum. I would never ask you to differentiate them by looking at a picture. I would ask you maybe which is the first part of the small intestines, what's the second, what's the third, what connects to the colon, which you should all know that. So know the three parts, but like I said, from a picture I won't ask you. Once the ileum joins in with the colon, it does so at the ileocecal valve, which I don't see on here, but I'm sure you all know that. And the colon will begin in the lower right-hand anatomical part of the stomach at the cecum. The cecum is just a little pouch. That's it. I'm not even quite sure why it has a separate name, but it does have the appendix hanging off of it. The colon then turns into the ascending colon, because that's the way foodstuffs will go, which is closer to feces. It bends at this hepatic flexure. It is good to know, hepatic flexure. It's near the liver, that's why it's called hepatic. And these flexures can be defined if you're doing a contrast X-ray or CAT scan. We then have the transverse colon and then the splenic flexure, which is the bend near the spleen. So these flexures are not a separate structure, they're just where the colon bends. We then have descending colon until it forms the S-shaped sigmoid. Once the sigmoid colon gets into the pelvic basin and it is straight, it is the rectum. R-E-C-T as a prefix means straight, rectum, straight. Okay, so colon, let's do that one more quick time. We have cecum with the appendix, ascending colon, hepatic flexure to transverse colon, splenic flexure. They say of the transverse colon. It's not necessarily of the transverse colon. It's a kind of separate structure. And then descending colon until it forms the S-shaped sigmoid. The sigmoid then turns into the rectum, which goes into the pelvic basin. It's all the same tube, guys. It just has different shapes to it. The anus will contain the sphincters that will hold feces until we're ready to void. Liver, gallbladder, and the biliary system, which is just the tubes that drain bile, we're going to talk about in a separate picture. All right, different parts of the small intestine. I liked this picture because you could see that C-shaped duodenum. And I think that's an important anatomical structure to understand because this is where the pyloric sphincter is. It's between the acidity of the stomach and the normal pH of the small intestines. And the duodenum also in this C-shaped region has the pancreas snuggled into it. And that's going to be important because I'll show you the pancreas is going to secrete digestive enzymes into the duodenum. It's brilliant, really, because this is where foodstuffs is leaving the stomach and starting to be processed in the small intestines. The jejunum and the ileum, like I told you, don't need to know the difference looking at a picture. I can tell you the way that I teach it in lab is that the ileum is a part that is attached to the cecum at that ileocecal valve. And the jejunum, I always just put the pin right in the middle and say it's right in the middle, okay? The duodenum is the C shape. It's only about 5 or 6 inches long. First part of the small intestines that attaches to the stomach. Got it. It's question time. Which of the following applies to the GI system? The stomach is the very first part of the tube. B, the splenic flexure is part of the small intestines. C, the duodenum is the first part of the small intestines attached to the stomach. D, the last part of the colon is the hepatic flexure. Choose wisely and we shall move on. I like this picture. It absolutely is not anatomically correct, but it gives you a summary of what happens to food as it enters from the left into the mouth. There are those salivary glands that start to moisten and break down food, travels through the esophagus to the stomach. There's storage and a little bit of digestion in the stomach. You don't even need to know what is digested in there. I could tell you if you really want me to, email me. The pancreas secretes digestive enzymes into the GI tube. The small intestines is going to digest and absorb. This is where the majority of our food absorption happens, in the small intestines. The gallbladder stores bile, the liver creates it, and bile helps to absorb fats and emulsify them. The large intestine is where digestion ends, but this is where the majority of water absorption occurs. There's that outpocketing of the cecum, and there's the anus, through which undigested materials pass as feces. So this shows, I think it's important to understand the different parts of the stomach. These are clinically important. So let's go through these. And I spoke to you about the esophagus entering the stomach. Right where it enters, I almost think of it as being like a little turtleneck at the top of the stomach here. This region right here is the cardiac portion of the stomach. Okay, I'm sorry, but your book has it wrong. Your book has something else labeled. Oh, they have it moved. They have it over here. Okay. Cardiac is really going to be over here, and I put an arrow. The very top rounded portion is the fundus. And the reason these are important is because the sphincter here is right where the diaphragm sits. Okay. And the diaphragm helps to hold the stomach down. There's only a small little opening through which the esophagus can pass. There's other openings as well, but speaking of the GI tract, there's only a small opening through which the esophagus can pass through the diaphragm to the stomach. If that hole becomes too big in the diaphragm, and it can be stretched, what can happen is the cardiac region can start to move up through the diaphragm towards the esophagus, pushing the esophagus up, and it can open up enough that even this fundal part can move up through the diaphragm. And this is where we get a hiatal hernia and GERD. And I'm going to completely go through those and explain them to you, but I want you to understand the parts of the stomach for that reason. Moving down the stomach, you've got the body, which narrows down into the pyloric region. At the pyloric region, there's a sphincter. And please note that there's a sphincter here known as the cardiac or the lower esophageal sphincter, some people call it. And we're going to talk about this pyloric sphincter because this can actually stenose or narrow. Now, the other thing I'd like to talk about is the GI tract along the full length of it, except in the stomach, has 2 layers of smooth muscle. The whole GI tract has longitudinal and circular. The stomach has an extra one called oblique. What these smooth muscle layers do is to allow different movements of food into the stomach and along the GI tract. It can help to churn it. It can also help to propel it forward through digestion. I'm not going to get into too much cellular stuff, but this is important. So we are going to talk about it. What we're looking at here is a small portion of the surface lining the tube of the esophagus and the stomach. So if you can imagine, we have the tube of the esophagus moving into the stomach. What they're showing you here is they pulled a little section of tissue out. So you can see the cells that line this surface, and they've moved it over here. And like I said, I'm not going to get too technical, but in someone who has no issues, can you see how different this lining, this is actually the stomach, looks from this? This is the esophagus. The esophagus lining you could see is really thick with lots of cells. The stomach lining is actually much thinner and it only covers this surface area. And the reason I'm showing that to you is because in the esophagus, all these lining cells do is protect. These are here much like the skin surface with multiple layers of cells that we can basically wear away and regenerate more. As opposed to the stomach side, where the cells become very thin, there's actually only one layer. It's hard to see on here. That's so we can absorb and secrete substances very easily across this membrane. Now, the reason that is important is if we get a hiatal hernia in which the stomach moves up above the diaphragm towards the esophagus, it will start to thin these linings in the esophagus and make it one cell thick like the stomach. And that cellular change, guys, is what causes Barrett's esophagus, where people are more prone to cancer in the esophagus because of that cellular change. So what you need to remember is in hiatal hernia, when the stomach comes up, and I'm going to show you how that happens in just a little bit above the diaphragm, the cells in the bottom of the esophagus start to change and become possibly cancerous. That'll be the easiest way to remember it. And of course, as always, if you have a question, you just let me know. So, GI system digests and eliminates foods. Basically, that's it. So, upper division is oral cavity to stomach. We talked about pharynx and esophagus. One thing I want to know is the intrinsic factor from stomach cells help to absorb B12. And this is potentially an issue with some patients who have to get B12 shots because they have to bypass the stomach so the B12 can be absorbed directly. Otherwise, it's destroyed in the acidity of the stomach and not absorbed because of that intrinsic factor. The lower division, small intestines to anus. We'll absorb food and water here as we looked at on those pictures. We create some vitamins such as K in the large intestine. The hepatobiliary system is the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. These are accessory glands that we have along the GI tract that helps to process food for absorption. The liver is the workhorse for this, and I have a list of what the liver does in the future. Gallbladder releases bile, and bile helps to emulsify fat so we can distribute it through the body and absorb it where we need it. And the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes for all of our macronutrients, our carbs, our lipids, our proteins. So those are very important in order to process food properly to be absorbed. So there's 4 layers that I had mentioned earlier. The mucosa, submucosa, muscle, and serosa. Remember that a mucosal lining is always open to the environment. So if I were to stick my finger down my throat, that surface is the mucosal surface. Submucosa, don't worry about it too much. It's just the layer under the mucosa. The muscular layer I spoke about has smooth muscle. It's got a longitudinal and a circular layer in order to churn and move forward food through the GI tract. The serosa is a layer on the very outside that just simply helps to anchor the GI system in place. Now, peritoneum is actually that serosal layer, but it really is a large serous membrane that lines the entire abdominal cavity and most of the organs. It's double layered. There's a layer on the wall called the parietal peritoneum. There's a layer on the organs known as visceral peritoneum. And they secrete a little bit of a serous watery fluid simply so organs don't rub against each other. In these areas, this is known as the peritoneal cavity. Many organs are peritoneal. If you have an organ that is not in these serous membranes, rather behind it, it's known as retroperitoneal, almost like a retro music store or clothing store. It's something that's behind the times. Retroperitoneal are organs that are behind the peritoneal cavity. And I had a hard time remembering them, so I made this silly mnemonic of kidneys ascend and descend down the pike. That means kidneys, ascending colon, descending colon, duodenum or duodenum, and pancreas. All of those organs are retroperitoneal. So if I ask you in the abdominal cavity, what is the uterus? Peritoneal. What is the stomach? Peritoneal. What is the liver? Peritoneal. What's the gallbladder? Etc. That's an easy way to remember. Clinically, why this is important is because you can get infections that will be peritoneal or retroperitoneal. In some cases, you can get both. In some areas, the mesentery actually comes together to form a double layer. Don't let this blow your mind. You probably remember when you did dissection, there was this big apron-like flap that when you opened the stomach, it was covered with fat. That is a greater omentum, and it just simply looks like a little flap or apron that hangs down from the bottom part of the stomach. And the reason that is important is that it actually is filled with blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. If there's a slight infection, the greater omentum will actually move a little bit and fight it off in the intestines. The other reason it is important is the greater omentum will fill with fat when people have truncal obesity. Truncal obesity is when you get almost that beer belly appearance, when fat fills this mesentery and makes the belly stick out. And the reason clinically that is important is people with that truncal obesity that tends to go into their abdomen tends to have more fat in and around their heart. And that, my friends, brings us to question time. Which of those organs are peritoneal? Duodenum or duodenum, ascending colon, pancreas, liver. Answer that and you will rock it. Let's see what's next. Okay, this is showing swallowing. You're like, what? Okay, the reason I want to show this to you, albeit very simple, is here is the trachea with the larynx or voice box at the top. Here is the epiglottis. Here is the esophagus. And what you can see as you move down is how the epiglottis closes down over the larynx, so the bolus of food can go down the esophagus rather than down the trachea. The other thing that I want to show you, if you look back at the top, the uvula, which is soft tissue and skeletal muscle, right there, actually goes back to close off the back of the throat so food cannot go up and out the nose. So I thought this was a great picture to show those mechanisms. As food moves down, peristalsis continues it to go in one direction, and you also have circular muscles which help to churn and move the food forward as well. And that process of moving food along is peristalsis. Let's talk about some of the accessory glands. So the liver does like everything. It's unbelievable. It helps to metabolize foodstuffs, and you can list all those things on your own, okay? Clotting factors it creates triglycerides, it creates our LDLs, HDLs, it stores glucose, which is stored as glycogen, it stores fats, micronutrients, huge storehouse for B12, for example. Detoxes our blood, processes alcohol, creates albumin, which is released in the bloodstream, and albumin keeps fluid in your cardiovascular circuit. It continues. It metabolizes medications. It produces bile. It gets rid of ammonia. It inactivates and prepares hormones for secretion. Okay, removes damaged or old erythrocytes to recycle them and gets rid of the leftover. Serves as a blood reservoir. My goodness. And it's the main converter of fatty acids into energy, and what are left are converted to ketones. It does like everything. If there's a question asking about metabolism of food and liver's a choice, and you don't know the real answer, guess liver. It's a good guess. And the gallbladder stores bile. Done. Okay, so the gallbladder does not create bile as a sidebar. It stores the bile. Bile is created in the liver. It's secreted through the biliary system, part of the ducts, and it's stored in the gallbladder. So if we look at a picture here, okay, so there's the liver, here's the gallbladder, and this is how it is in the anatomical patient, human patient. Not so much in the cat, but definitely in a human patient. And the duct that leaves the liver, let's keep it simple. You just need to know hepatic duct, okay, is going to be the one, excuse me, that comes from the liver. The cystic duct is the one that goes to and from the gallbladder. Now, where they conjoin together, it becomes bile duct. Some people call it the common bile duct. And this bile duct comes down into the duodenum. At the same location, we actually have the pancreatic duct, which is the duct that brings enzymes from the pancreas into the duodenum. So the liver and the gallbladder will send bile into that duct system, into the duodenum, and that's, you don't need to know any more names. You don't need to know there's duodenal papillae, blah, 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 blah. Just as long as you know cystic duct, hepatic duct, bile duct, that's good. That bile duct will be dumped into the duodenum and put bile into the duodenum. It joins up with the pancreatic duct, which also sends enzymes into the duodenum. You can also see here the pancreas has different parts, and these are easy. The head is this part, the body, and then the tail. And the head of the pancreas sits in the lap of the duodenum, is a way to remember where that is located. The tail actually is close to the spleen. This is really delayed. So the tail will be near the spleen. Okay, and this is how it secretes the enzymes and the bile to be put into the duodenum. And it's brilliant, really, because it's right at the beginning of where we begin absorption. Okay, so the pancreas has exocrine and endocrine functions. Endocrine functions produces hormones to regulate blood glucose. Those we'll go over in the very, very near future. Let's talk about exocrine functions. So the majority of the pancreas is actually made up of cells that perform these exocrine functions. They produce enzymes, electrolytes, and water necessary for digestion. Okay, their primary job is producing those enzymes. And we pretty much went over the anatomy of it. I talked about the head, body, and tail. And you could see the pancreatic duct entering the duodenum there. Looking up close, once again, I'm not going to kill you with cellular stuff, but keeping it really simple, you could see the islets of Langerhans, which are very light staining. The islets of Langerhans contain the cells that will regulate glucose metabolism in the pancreas. The acini, that's A-C-I-N-I, are all the rest of the cells, and the acini are what secrete digestive enzymes. And as I said, we're going to go over the islets of Langerhans in the very near future. And that brings us, my friends, to a question time and a small break. The digestive enzymes are mostly stored in the pancreas. True or false? Answer that, take a break, get a coffee, and I'll see you in the next video.